And welcome everyone. Thanks again for attending. Today we're going to be taking a look at our document and our version control numbers. So two sets of values that if you're a FileHold user, anytime you've set up a document type or a schema, you know you've seen the document control numbers down below the version control numbers. We're going to have a look at these and explain what they are and how we can use them. They're an extremely powerful tool, but they're also a rarely used tool because they're very specialized. And I'm going to kind of explain a little bit why that specialization exists. So before I start, let's just talk about what these are. Essentially, out of the box, these are a prefix followed by a number that can either relate to the document control or a version control number. So it's something generated in the system that's a prefix followed by a number that you can set up. Now that can be customized to be much more elaborate. So it doesn't need to be just a simple prefix. It can draw information from other metadata fields. It can use merge tags, but that's usually done as a custom service. So we're not going to be covering that today. We're just going to be looking at the bare bone basics of it. We're also going to look at how these can be set manually or they can automatically tick up. We're going to see that with our document control numbers, that they can be set to automatically generate the number or they can be manually entered depending on what the use case is. So a document control number, or a DCN, and I'm going to use the abbreviation DCN for the most part today. A DCN is a unique value attached to a document, record, or offline document that's been added to FileHold. So only that document can contain that particular number. The whole point of a DCN is that it prevents the system from adding another document with that same number. These are designed for use where only one document or record can have that value and it cannot be changed once it's been set. A version control number, on the other hand, is slightly different than that. It is a value attached to versions of a document, record, or offline document. So there's some sort of input that you're putting onto there to say this represents the version for this document. These are an interpreted version value of significance to an organization. And we're going to come back to what I mean by when I say interpreted in just a second. So how are DCNs or VCNs different than metadata? So we know what our metadata and file properties window looks like. We've seen that before. The top portion of this is what we call descriptive metadata. So it describes the information onto there. And you can see the edit button is right there, so you can click onto that and you can edit that information as you need. Your descriptive metadata is formatted by your organizational needs. We all know that. It can be defined by users. So anybody who comes into there, if you have a right to edit this, you could go in and you could change any of those values that you wanted to. And effectively, this is unrestricted information that you're attaching to a document. The lower section of that panel is what we call administrative metadata. You can influence it, but you can't change it. So it's no ability to directly edit that. No matter how hard I try, I can't click on any part of that to change the owner. Now, there's an option that I have if I'm an administrator of change document ownership when I right-click a document. You'll see that in your right-click menu. If you're an admin, you can change a document's ownership, and that will change the value there, but I can't directly edit it. So these are administrative values that FileHold is holding that helps to describe the document. These are linked to the version and the properties for the document, so 2 points together. This version of the document is owned by Chris, that's part of the properties for it, and so we see that reflected there. And this is a tightly controlled piece of environment. You can't just come into this and play around with it. And this is where we see a document control number being used because it's down there in that administrative metadata. So when you have an opportunity to enter information for it, once that's been established, it doesn't change. So we're locking information to a version of a document. Now, it's worth talking about the difference between version numbers and version control numbers, or VCNs. And it's one of the reasons why I like saying VCN, because it keeps the word version out of my mouth, because it makes sure that we're not getting things confused. We've seen documents inside the library view, and when we zoom, we see that we've got the version over there as a category. Now, the version number is absolute. It doesn't matter what you do to that document. You might have gone into it and changed the spelling on one of the words, or you might have added 30 paragraphs worth of text to the end of it. Doesn't matter to FileHold. When you check a document out, it becomes a new version when you check it back in, regardless of what changes you've made to it. But when we're looking at a version control number, we can actually change that when the document gets checked in and out if we want to. So it is not an absolute version, it is an interpreted value. So the VCN is interpreted by the organization through the process used to define a version number, and then it's decided when it will be advanced. So if I say that this is version 1.1, I make a minor change to it, I can say this is now 1.2 when I check it back in. Maybe the next person looks at it and they realize that there's a period that's off, but it's not enough of an edit for them to be able to say it's a whole new point version. So maybe they keep it as 1.2, and then somebody runs it through a workflow, and at the end of that they say, great, we're going to promote this now to version 2.0. So there's additional ways of being able to tie in some of those functions. It really takes that number and makes it meaningful for releases, for total version numbers, and it's different than that absolute version number because you're interpreting what that number means to the organization. So the version could be 100, but the VCN could be 1.0. They're not directly related. They often have something of a relationship, but that's understood by the organization, not by the document management software, which just treats the version number as absolute. So using DCNs or VCNs, and we can sort of put them in the same category even though they have different functions, they can only be used in a schema with no documents, records, or offline documents. The schema must be empty before we start using them. So if you have an existing schema full of documents and you're going, perfect, I'm now ready to start adding a DCN to it, I'm afraid you can't. FileHold will stop you from doing that because every document needs that unique identifier, and you'd have to go through the process of tagging it, and it's not allowed to happen. You could make a new schema that matches all the values of what you currently have with common metadata fields and start transferring your documents one by one over to there. That's the only way to deploy a DCN once you start using that particular schema. Once they're used, they cannot be turned off or edited. So once you start using a DCN, it's fixed and it starts attaching those numbers to the document's properties. So once you use it, you can't turn it off, and you also can't modify the DCN once it's being used. These are typically used for an internal or regulatory processes demand that they're going to be used. So we don't see this being used sort of on a casual basis because they're much more strict, they're much more structured pieces of information. And they can be customized to allow more complicated naming patterns. What I'm going to show you is very primitive, a simple prefix followed by a number. And that can actually be made much more elaborate depending on what your requirements are for that. And that's something our professional services team can help out with. If you've never heard of DCNs or VCNs before, chances are you don't need them. They're a great tool, but I want to make sure we're putting this into the proper context here. If you look at this and you say, I don't know if these will be useful, I don't know if there's a requirement for these, you may be 100% correct, and there is no requirement, and you can feel free to not worry about this. But it's worth taking a look at how we use these because they do have some value, and you might see an opportunity for that to be used in the future. Most often they're used because regulations require them. For instance, ISO standards are often using a document control number, for example. We also see it used quite often in the aerospace industry because it's an area where having a unique identifier for every document is very valuable. So for today, what we're going to do is before we can use a DCN or VCN, we must have an empty schema. So we're going to go through the mechanics. We're going to create a very quick generic schema. Then we're going to create a DCN, create a VCN. We're going to add a document to that generic schema, and then we're going to look at the DCN and the VCN and the version properties. So fairly simple deployment. We're not going to get into a deeper use case because when we're building them, we can only build them to something that's empty. We can't build them to something that's already in the system. So in that context, let's go ahead and dive into our FileHold system. So we're going to start off with our desktop over here, and I'll just show you. We have in our library a test cabinet, drawer, and a folder called document, and it's empty. I'm waiting for content to be added to it. Now up under administration, library configuration, you may have control fields over here. You can also access these through the web client. So I'll go into the web client, go into my full administration menu. Oh, I appear to have logged out due to an activity. That's our safety features. Let's go back into that administration view. Sorry, I was in the admin view there. I didn't need to go out of that. There we are. And down here, we've also got our control fields down below. And again, it's a list that we can then add a document control field or add a version control field, whichever one that we need to build for ourselves. We're going to go back over to here and we're going to click our plus sign in the desktop application. And then we need to give a name for this. So we're going to just do this and we're going to call this webinar example DCN. So we're going to start off with a document control number. So as you can see, there's no other tabs or further information here. I have to go through and choose a document control field to make a DCN, and then I've got the tab over here, which I can then open up. So we need to do a prefix for these if we want one. Now it requires a prefix of some kind. That helps to distinguish this from a number. We're not just using these as a number, this is a document control number. Now this can be anything you want it to be, but in our case, we're going to call this web just for the webinar that we're doing today, and we'll use that as our abbreviation. Then the maximum number of length. Now, one of the things that this can do is actually generate leading zeros for you. So if it needs to be a 6 character, you can say that the maximum length is going to be 6 characters, and then the first document would be 0000001, and then the next one would be 0000002, etc. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. So we're going to say we're going to do a 6 character. Now, the initial value it says is going to be 1. It's going to start with 1 and work its way up. And in this case, I'm going to say the numbers are going to be automatically generated, and I can start with any number I want to. So if I wanted it to be 1, let's do 00001. So that's going to be my first document, will be 100,001. That's going to be my first number into here because it's a 6 character, and that's where we're going to start our numbering from. Now, sometimes you're dealing with a system that's generating numbers for you, or you have an existing system that's generating those numbers. Perfect. Use those numbers into here and do not automatically generate them. Then your user can type in the value. If that number is being used by another document, FileHold will prevent you from adding that document into the system. So that's part of the protection of the DCN. That's one of the reasons why we're using it. So that's sufficient for now to have our information on the document. So I'm going to say OK to that. All right, so we've got our first field into there. So webinar example for a DCN. Let's build our second one now. So we're going to hit our plus sign, and we're going to call this webinar example VCN, so our version control number for this. And as you'd expect, we're going to do our field type, choose version control field, our field properties, and you'll see it's a much more limited thing. We're not automatically generating the version numbers. This is information that we want our users to type into it. So our prefix in this case, again, it's a requirement. So we're going to call this web, and I'm going to say web v, so web versions. We would see that and we'd see it's a web version. And I'm going to put a space in there too to give a bit of a breath in between this and the number. And the maximum number of length, in this case, I'm going to say that I want this to be no more than 3 characters in length. So we've got a little bit of length for ourselves. And we're going to say OK to that. And we've built our webinar example DCN, webinar example VCN. So we're going to close out our screen. We're now going to go over and open up our document schemas. And just to show you, if I open up an existing document that has documents into it, you'll see that these are both grayed out. I can't add them into here because the system won't let me because there's already documents that have content into there. Whereas if, let's go back to that previous screen, let's take a look at our VCN test. This had a document in it before, and because it had a document in it before, it's also locked it down. So it's not just a matter of it being empty, it's also a matter of it being unused. So we've got that, the version test field is locked onto this one, so I can't change it to something else. So we're going to have to build ourselves a new schema, so we're going to do that, and we're going to call this webinar DCN VCN, just so we've got a name for it. Now, this is where we'd want to go through and complete the rest of our tabs, but we're not going to worry about that for right now. I know it's valuable information, but it's not hyper important for this. More what I want to do is show you how to deploy the numbers. So because it's a brand new document schema, then I've got the options down here, and I can choose whichever one of my DCNs that I've built that I want to use, and I'm going to choose my webinar example DCN, and we're going to choose our webinar example VCN. So again, I can assign any of the available ones to me. What this means is that a schema could be sharing a DCN with an existing document schema that's using them. So you have a document schema A, it has a DCN attached to it. 2 years later, you build document schema B, and you want to use that same DCN, you absolutely can. So you can keep using the number, and it will control which documents are getting the number based on sequential addition if you're using that tick up function on it. So don't be afraid of it doesn't need to be a unique DCN or VCN per document schema. It can be shared as a common field used between more than one document type, but the same restrictions apply. Once I start using these, I can't turn them off of this, and it has to be a brand new schema when I get started. So now that I've done that, we're going to go ahead and say OK. So we've now built our new document type into there, and now we're ready to add content into the system. So we're going to add a test document here into our folder. We hit the Add Document button. It's going to come up. Let's go over to my desktop. And I'm going to take my generic sample document, and now it's going to ask what I want to apply to it. So in this case, we're going to choose our webinar DCN VCN. And you see we've been invited to add a version control number onto this, but we've not been asked about putting in a document control number because that's being automatically generated for us. So we'll call this 0.1. There we are. And then once we're happy with that, then it looks like my button may have slipped off there. That's okay. We're just going to go ahead and hit enter onto that. No, I need to hide my bar. That's just reformatting my computer recently, and I have lost my I've lost my my bar into there. So I need to. No, not letting me do that. Let's try this. Sometimes the hyperware does not work well for you, and that's just what can happen, and it's good times. And yeah, it's hiding my add document button into there, so that's delightful. So let's try that again over here. And if this doesn't work, I'll just add it through the web client because it's not a significant amount of time to do that. All right, and 0.1, and yeah, still hiding it there. So we'll go back over to our web client. That's me and my VMware. That's not a FileHold thing. It's just a silly thing that can happen to me. When I had to recently do a major update onto this, and it's just an odd sizing thing. So that's a bit annoying. But we'll go ahead and we'll add a document into here. We'll put it into our, we'll browse to our document, find our same sample document as before. We'll select our folder. There we go. Now we'll define our metadata, again, the only field that we have. We'll put in that 0.1 and we'll submit it. All right, document's been added. There it is. Let's head back over to the FDA. Let's remove this from the inbox. We'll go over to our folder. There's our document. Right-click onto that, go to the metadata and file properties. And sure enough, down here, you can see that we've got the version control number, v.1, and we've got the FileHold ID number, which is already established to it. So we have our information that's been attached to it, and it's been controlled for it. So our version control number is defined, and our DCN, where did our DCN go? Did I properly associate this? I used the VCN test. I used the wrong document type. That's my mistake. Let's try that again. Sorry about that. I wasn't expecting the thing not to, the VMware is doing me badly today, and that's just a good time for all. So let's go back into add document. I had this is a test folder I was using before, and I added the wrong. I put it into the wrong schema, so I used one that doesn't have that other schema designation for it. So again, we'll grab our sample document. We'll browse to our folder. Add it into the document folder there. Change this to our webinar test. Metadata of 0.1, submit. There we go. And now we'll go back into this and we'll do a quick refresh of the library. And there's our document. And down below, we can see both the document control number with the web 100001 and then the version control number web v space 0.1. So we've kept that information intact onto it. So we have both the document control number and the version control number there. Now, as I was saying before, now that we've started using it, if I go back over now to my document schemas and I go to my webinar, these are now frozen. It's a grayed out window. I can't modify these now that I've started using them. So I'd have to abandon the schema in order to no longer use them. So this is something where we highly recommend test before you actually deploy. Make sure that you're comfortable with these, because again, once you start using them, you can't make corrections to them later on.